In a packed courtroom, wealthy industrialist Richard Blackwell stands triumphantly as his lawyer presents seemingly damning evidence against Maya Wilson, a black housekeeper accused of abusing his daughter. The case appears sealed until 9-year-old Charlotte Blackwell breaks free from her caretaker, races to the witness stand, and declares, "Stop lying about Maya. I know what really happened, and why Daddy doesn't want me to tell anyone." The courtroom erupts in chaos as Richard lunges toward his daughter. Security intervenes, and Charlotte's tearful eyes lock with Maya's across the room. Before I continue this shocking true story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for truth, and subscribe to hear more stories of justice prevailing against all of justice. Odds. What would you do if you witnessed a powerful man trying to silence his own child in court? Let's find out what happened next in this incredible story of courage and truth. Maya Wilson never imagined her life would be turned upside down the day she accepted a position as live-in housekeeper for one of the wealthiest men in Boston. At 38, the former elementary school teacher had left her career after budget cuts eliminated her position at an underfunded public school in a predominantly black neighborhood. Despite having a master's degree in early childhood education and 15 years of glowing recommendations, Maya found herself applying for domestic positions to make ends meet while supporting her younger sister through nursing school. Richard Blackwell, the 49-year-old CEO of Blackwell Industries, a technology empire valued at over $4 billion, had interviewed 7 candidates before hiring Maya. His wife Rebecca had passed away 2 years earlier after a fall down the marble staircase in their Beacon Hill mansion, leaving Richard to raise their daughter Charlotte alone while managing his expanding business interests. The pristine 20-room mansion felt cavernous and cold when Maya first arrived, with expensive art adorning the walls but few signs of the warmth that makes a house a home. Charlotte, a small, pale child with large blue eyes, and her mother's blonde curls barely spoke during their first week together. Maya noticed how the 9-year-old flinched at sudden movements and kept her eyes downcast whenever her father entered a room. Richard maintained a professional distance from Maya, communicating primarily through his personal assistant or via text messages with specific instructions about Charlotte's schedule. He traveled frequently, often gone for weeks at international business meetings, leaving Charlotte in Maya's care. During these absences, Maya observed the child gradually emerging from her shell, displaying a bright intelligence and creative imagination that seemed to disappear the moment her father's return was announced. Richard's mother, Eleanor Blackwell, a stern 70-year-old society matron, with impeccably coiffed silver hair and a perpetual expression of disapproval, visited regularly to check on things. During these visits, Maya couldn't help but notice the subtle but persistent racist remarks. Eleanor made questioning Maya's education, expressing surprise at her articulate speech and making comments about knowing one's place in the household. Despite Eleanor's thinly veiled hostility, Maya focused on Charlotte, whose blossoming under her care brought genuine joy to her work. They established routines together with Maya, helping Charlotte with homework, reading stories, and slowly introducing activities the child had never experienced, from baking cookies to visiting the public library. One evening, while helping Charlotte prepare for bed, Maya noticed bruises on the child's upper arms, fingerprint-shaped marks that couldn't have come from typical childhood play. When gently questioned, Charlotte withdrew immediately, insisting she had fallen during gym class. Maya documented the bruises with her phone camera, noting the date and Charlotte's explanation, her professional training making her wary of the inconsistency between the injury and the explanation. As weeks passed, Maya noticed a troubling pattern. Charlotte's nightmares and bedwetting increased dramatically in the days following Richard's returns from business trips, only to gradually subside after he left again. The child who laughed while making paper airplanes with Maya would transform into a silent, watchful ghost whenever her father was home. Richard seemed oblivious to his daughter's distress, focused instead on critiquing Charlotte's academic performance, posture, table manners, and appearance, often reducing the child to tears with his harsh standards. Maya began keeping a detailed journal of Charlotte's behavioral changes and physical marks, her concern growing with each passing day. What she didn't yet realize was that Richard Blackwell had installed cameras throughout the house, reviewing footage each night in his study, watching their every move and listening to their every conversation, already planning how to use Maya's growing attachment to Charlotte against her, if necessary. 6 months into Maya's employment at the Blackwell mansion, the subtle warning signs she'd been noticing crystallized into unmistakable red flags that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. Charlotte's behavior had become increasingly erratic, with periods of withdrawal followed by desperate attachment to Maya clinging to her whenever Richard was nearby. The bedwetting, which had initially seemed like an occasional issue, now happened almost nightly, and Charlotte had begun hoarding food in her bedroom closet, wrapping pieces of bread or fruit in napkins during meals, and secreting them away as if preparing for some future deprivation. One particularly concerning development was Charlotte's new habit of checking locks repeatedly before bed, asking Maya multiple times if her bedroom door could be locked from the inside. Maya had discovered Charlotte hiding in her closet one night, curled into a tight ball among her shoes, rocking slightly with her small hands pressed over her ears. When Maya had gently coaxed her out and asked what had frightened her, Charlotte's response sent ice through her veins. "I can't tell you, or bad things will happen." The child's eyes had darted toward the hallway, toward the direction of Richard's master suite, before she reluctantly allowed herself to be tucked back into bed. Richard had begun spending more time at home, ostensibly to strengthen his bond with Charlotte, though Maya noticed these father-daughter activities often involved Richard criticizing Charlotte's performance at piano practice or correcting her table manners, rather than engaging in any genuinely nurturing interaction. He had also begun increasing Maya's workload, significantly adding duties that kept her occupied in distant parts of the house while he spent time alone with Charlotte. New security measures appeared throughout the mansion without explanation. Keypads on certain doors, cameras in hallways and common areas, but conspicuously none in Charlotte's bedroom or Richard's private study. Maya's own quarters had a camera prominently mounted in the corner, which Richard explained was standard security protocol. Eleanor's visits increased in frequency, and her comments to Maya grew more openly hostile, with remarks like, "People like you shouldn't be disciplining white children," or questioning whether Maya was touching Charlotte's things. When items in the child's room were moved, Maya often caught Eleanor watching her with narrowed eyes, particularly when Charlotte showed affection toward her. One morning, Maya discovered her personal journal had been moved from its hiding place under her mattress, though nothing appeared to be missing. Her phone sometimes showed evidence of having been accessed while she was showering or doing laundry in the basement. Richard began questioning her about private calls to her sister, specifically conversations where Maya had expressed concern about Charlotte's well-being, making it clear he was monitoring her communications. Thomas Rodriguez, the groundskeeper who had worked for the Blackwells for over a decade, pulled Maya aside one day while she was hanging laundry in the back garden. In hushed tones, he warned her that she was the 4th housekeeper in 3 years, and that her predecessors had all left, suddenly signing non-disclosure agreements and receiving substantial settlements before disappearing. When Maya pressed for details, Thomas glanced nervously at the security cameras and simply said, "Be careful what you document and keep copies somewhere safe." That night, Maya heard muffled crying coming from Charlotte's room around 2 in the morning. When she approached the child's door, she was startled by Richard emerging from inside, closing the door firmly behind him. His explanation that Charlotte had a nightmare and he was comforting her might have seemed reasonable, except for the alcohol on his breath and the way his eyes couldn't quite meet Maya's. The following morning, Charlotte was unusually subdued at breakfast, refusing to meet Maya's concerned gaze across the table, while Richard chatted with uncharacteristic animation about plans for a father-daughter weekend trip to their lake house in New Hampshire. When Richard left for a meeting, Maya gently asked Charlotte about her nightmare, only to have the child burst into tears and beg not to be left alone with her father at the lake house. Alarmed, Maya tried to probe further, but Charlotte abruptly changed the subject when they heard Eleanor's car pulling into the driveway. Later that day, Maya received a text from Richard informing her that her weekend off was canceled due to Charlotte's academic needs, and she would be accompanying them to the lake house after all. That night, Maya made copies of her journal entries and photographs of Charlotte's injuries, sending them to her personal email account and to her sister for safekeeping, increasingly certain that something was very wrong in the Blackwell household and equally certain that Richard was becoming aware of her suspicions. The weather matched the atmosphere in the Blackwell mansion that fateful Friday night in late October, with howling winds lashing rain against leaded glass windows and thunder occasionally shaking the foundation of the historic home. Richard had returned from a particularly tense week of business negotiations in Tokyo, his company stock having dropped 15% after a failed merger attempt that had cost investors millions. Maya had watched him arrive, noting the rigid set of his shoulders and the way he had barely acknowledged Charlotte's timid attempt at a welcome-home hug before locking himself in his study with a decanter of scotch. Charlotte had been on edge all day, knowing her father would be returning, and had barely touched her dinner before asking to be excused early to her room. Maya had tucked her in at 8:30, reading an extra chapter from their current book to help soothe the child's obvious anxiety. By 11, the house had grown quiet, except for the occasional clink of glass from Richard's study, where he remained sequestered with his electronic devices and his alcohol. Maya had been drifting off to sleep in her third-floor quarters when a sound jolted her awake shortly after midnight. At first she thought it was part of the storm, but then recognized it as a muffled cry coming from Charlotte's second-floor bedroom. Years of teaching had attuned her to the different sounds children make, and this wasn't the cry of a child having a nightmare, but something more desperate and frightened. Maya pulled on her robe and slippers, moving quickly but quietly down the service stairs that connected to the hallway near Charlotte's room. As she approached, she heard a deep voice speaking in harsh, slurred tones, followed by what sounded like a slap and another muffled cry. Her heart hammering, Maya hesitated only a moment before continuing forward. But before she could reach Charlotte's door, it opened, and Richard emerged, his dress shirt partially unbuttoned, and his face flushed with alcohol. He startled at the sight of her in the darkened hallway, eyes narrowing dangerously as he demanded, "What are you doing up at this hour?" Maya, struggling to keep her voice, even explained she had heard what sounded like crying and was checking on Charlotte. Richard stepped toward her, using his considerable height advantage to loom over her as he stated coldly, "Charlotte had a nightmare. I handled it. Return to your quarters immediately." The smell of expensive scotch was overwhelming, and Maya noticed a small dark stain on his cuff that looked disturbingly like blood. She stood her ground, her concern for Charlotte overriding her instinct for self-preservation, asking if she might just check on the child herself since she was already up. Richard's expression shifted, a mask of parental concern sliding into place, as he assured her everything was fine, that Charlotte was already back asleep, and that Maya's interference would only wake her again. His tone left no room for argument, and Maya reluctantly returned to her room, though she remained awake, listening intently for any further sounds from Charlotte's bedroom. Morning arrived with artificial brightness. Richard appearing at breakfast in a crisp suit, acting as though nothing unusual had occurred during the night. Charlotte entered the dining room last, moving slowly and keeping her head down. But Maya immediately noticed her split lip and the dark bruise forming around her left wrist. When Maya asked what had happened, Richard answered before Charlotte could speak, explaining that his daughter had fallen out of bed during her nightmare, hitting her face on the nightstand. Charlotte remained silent, pushing food around her plate without eating, flinching, when Richard placed a hand on her shoulder before leaving for a meeting downtown. The moment he was gone, Maya knelt beside Charlotte's chair, gently asking what had really happened, but the child only shook her head, eyes filling with tears as she whispered, "I can't say. He'll be mad." Determined to document the injuries, Maya took Charlotte to the bathroom under the pretense of cleaning her face, using her phone to photograph the split lip and bruised wrist. Charlotte's eyes darted nervously toward the bathroom door, as if expecting her father to burst in at any moment. Maya had just finished taking the photos when Richard's voice came through the house intercom system, announcing he had forgotten some documents and was returning home briefly. Charlotte's entire body began trembling, and she grabbed Maya's arm with unexpected strength, begging her to delete the photos before her father saw them. Maya quickly sent the images to her email before deleting them from her phone, promising Charlotte that she would keep her safe. By the time Richard returned, Maya had composed herself, but something in her demeanor must have alerted him because he requested to borrow her phone to make an urgent call when his own battery had supposedly died. When she hesitated, his pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. He reminded her of the employment contract and non-disclosure agreement she had signed, emphasizing the clauses about loyalty and privacy. Reluctantly, Maya handed over her phone, knowing the photos were already deleted but fearing what else he might find. He disappeared into his study for 20 minutes before returning the phone with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, thanking her for her cooperation. That evening, after Charlotte had been put to bed, Maya was summoned to Richard's study, where he sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, the security camera monitor visible on a side table showing feeds from throughout the house. Without preamble, he showed her footage of her taking photographs in the bathroom that morning, asking in a dangerously quiet voice why she was documenting his daughter without permission. Before Maya could formulate a response, he played another clip from the previous week, showing Charlotte whispering to Maya, the audio enhanced to reveal the child, asking if they could go away somewhere. "Daddy can't find us." He swiveled his monitor to show her emails had been accessed, including the ones where she had sent the photos to herself. Richard's voice remained eerily calm as he informed Maya her employment was terminated effective immediately for attempted kidnapping and violation of her non-disclosure agreement. He instructed her to pack only essential items and leave the premises within the hour, stating that her final paycheck would be withheld, pending an investigation into her misconduct. As security escorted her to her room, Maya caught a glimpse of Charlotte watching from the crack in her bedroom door, her small face streaked with silent tears, one hand raised in a tiny, secret wave of goodbye. Comment number 1. If you think Maya should have contacted authorities immediately after seeing Charlotte's injuries, or comment number 2, if you believe she was right to try gathering more evidence first. Like this video if you've ever witnessed someone abusing their power to silence others, and subscribe to follow Maya's fight for justice against a powerful man who thinks his money can buy him immunity. What do you think will happen to Charlotte now that her protector has been removed from the house? And how far will Richard go to make sure his secrets stay buried? Stay with me to find out how this shocking story of abuse and courage continues. Maya had barely settled into her sister Lisa's small two-bedroom apartment in Dorchester when the pounding on the door began, startling them both awake just after 6 in the morning. 4 police officers stood in the hallway, warrant in hand, stone-faced as they recited Miranda rights and placed handcuffs on Maya's wrists tight enough to bruise. Neighbors peered through cracked doors as the officers led her away, one of them carrying the small suitcase she'd been permitted to take from the Blackwell mansion. At the police station, the reality of her situation became horrifyingly clear. Richard Blackwell had accused her of physically abusing Charlotte over a period of months, claiming he had discovered the abuse only recently when Charlotte finally broke down and confessed her fear of her caretaker. Maya sat in stunned silence as the detective listed the charges against her: child abuse, assault, and battery on a child under 14, reckless endangerment of a child, and attempting to intimidate a witness. If convicted, she faced up to 15 years in prison. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming at first glance. Surveillance footage showing Maya and Charlotte alone together, cleverly edited to remove context from their interactions. Photographs of Charlotte's injuries spanning several months with timestamps that corresponded to periods when Richard was away on business. Psychological evaluations from Dr. Temena Zevon. Lawrence Phillips, a child psychologist on Richard's payroll, containing Charlotte's supposed testimony that Miss Maya hurt me when Daddy wasn't home and said nobody would believe me if I told. Maya's repeated denials fell on deaf ears as the interrogation stretched for hours, the detectives clearly having already decided her guilt based on the mountain of evidence Richard had provided. By afternoon, she faced a judge for arraignment, where the prosecutor requested she be held without bail, citing flight risk and the seriousness of the charges against a wealthy family's vulnerable child. Maya's court-appointed attorney, David Chen, seemed overwhelmed by the case, his wrinkled suit and harried demeanor standing in stark contrast to the prosecution's polished confidence. Despite his efforts, bail was set at $500,000, an impossible sum for Maya or her sister to produce. As officers led her to a holding cell, Maya caught a glimpse of a television in the precinct break room where her driver's license photo was being broadcast alongside headlines reading, "Trusted Nanny Arrested for Abusing. Billionaire's Daughter and Blackwell Heiress. Subjected to months of abuse by household staff." The media coverage only worsened over the following days, with subtle racist undertones permeating the reporting. References to Maya's intimidating presence in the household, speculation about her hidden resentment of wealth, and constant emphasis on the contrast between the privileged white child and her underprivileged black caretaker. Editorials questioned how someone with her background had been hired for such a sensitive position, implying that Richard's charitable attempt to give opportunities to less fortunate communities had backfired tragically. Eleanor Blackwell gave tearful interviews describing how Maya had gradually isolated Charlotte from the family, claiming she had noticed aggressive tendencies but had given Maya the benefit of the doubt despite her background. The story dominated local news cycles and began picking up national attention, with photos of Charlotte's injuries leaked to journalists, and Richard portrayed as a devastated father who had trusted the wrong person with his precious daughter. Meanwhile, Maya discovered that her previously stellar references had suddenly become unreachable, with former employers claiming no recollection of her work or refusing to comment due to the ongoing investigation. Her teaching credentials were called into question, with anonymous sources suggesting she had left her teaching position under suspicious circumstances rather than due to budget cuts. David Chen seemed increasingly pessimistic about their chances as the prosecution's case continued to build, suggesting Maya consider a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentence. The district attorney's office had offered 15 years reduced to 8, with the possibility of parole after 5 in exchange for a full confession and public apology to the Blackwell family. During a particularly bleak evening in her cell, a guard delivered a note that had been left with her personal effects. The expensive stationery contained just 3 sentences in elegant handwriting. "A signed confession will result in an immediate substantial payment to your sister's account. Your prison sentence will be served at a minimum security facility with certain privileges. This offer expires in 48 hours. There was no signature, but Maya recognized the stationery from Richard's desk. The implication was clear: plead guilty, take the money, and this would all go away as quietly as possible. As she stared at the note, Maya thought of Charlotte's frightened eyes and tiny wave goodbye. The choice before her seemed impossible. Fight a case that appeared unwinnable against one of the most powerful men in Boston, or accept defeat and leave Charlotte to whatever fate awaited her in that mansion. She had no illusions about what Richard was capable of, or what might happen to Charlotte without someone to protect her. That night, Maya made the decision that would change everything she rejected. The plea deal refused to confess to crimes she hadn't committed, and instructed David Chen to prepare for trial regardless of the consequences. What she didn't yet realize was that her defiance would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the dark secrets behind the Blackwell family's perfect facade, and that her fight for justice would soon gain unexpected allies. Maya's refusal of the plea deal sent shockwaves through Richard Blackwell's carefully constructed plan, setting off a series of frantic moves to strengthen the case against her before trial. Meanwhile, Maya's sister Lisa, a practical woman who had always lived paycheck to paycheck, made the most significant financial decision of her life, mortgaging her modest apartment to raise funds for a better attorney. The $75,000 she managed to secure wasn't enough for the high-powered defense team Richard could afford, but it was sufficient to retain Vanessa Taylor, a 44-year-old black attorney. With a reputation for taking on cases involving racial discrimination and police misconduct. Vanessa's first meeting with Maya in the detention center's visitation room was a stark contrast to her interactions with David Chen, where he had been apologetic and deferential, Vanessa was sharp-focused and refused to be intimidated by the Blackwell name or resources. "The more resources they're throwing at prosecuting a housekeeper," she told Maya after reviewing the case files, "the more convinced I am they're hiding something significant." Vanessa's first move was to file motions, challenging the edited surveillance footage, demanding access to the original, unaltered videos from the Blackwell mansion. She also petitioned to have Charlotte interviewed by an independent psychologist not connected to the Blackwell family, arguing that Dr. Phillips' evaluation was compromised by his financial relationship with Richard. Both motions were initially denied by Judge Robert Campbell, a longtime associate of Richard's, who frequently attended the same charity galas and golf club functions. Undeterred, Vanessa began building an alternative narrative, seeking out other employees of the Blackwell household who might have witnessed interactions between Maya Charlotte and Richard. Most refused to speak, citing non-disclosure agreements or simply not returning calls. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Thomas Rodriguez, the groundskeeper, who had warned Maya months earlier, contacted Vanessa through a burner phone, agreeing to meet at a diner 20 miles outside Boston. Thomas arrived looking over his shoulder, constantly revealing that after Maya's arrest, all household staff had been required to sign additional confidentiality agreements, specifically about the case, with substantial financial penalties for any contact with Maya or her representatives. Despite this, Thomas shared what he had observed over his 12 years, working for the Blackwells. Rebecca Blackwell's increasingly fearful behavior before her fatal accident, previous household employees who left abruptly with settlements and non-disclosure agreements, and most importantly, his observations of Charlotte's behavior around her father versus her behavior with Maya. "The little girl was like a different person when Mr. Blackwell was gone," he told Vanessa. "With Maya, she laughed, talked a lot, seemed like a normal kid. When her father came home, it was like watching a flower close up tight." Thomas provided Vanessa with contact information for Jessica Morales, a former housekeeper who had worked for the Blackwells 2 years earlier, just after Rebecca's death and before Maya's employment. After 3 declined calls and several text messages, Jessica finally agreed to meet Vanessa at her attorney's office in Worcester. Jessica arrived with her own lawyer present, clearly terrified, despite the precautions, explaining that her settlement agreement included a $5 million penalty for discussing the Blackwell family. Only after Vanessa assured her that whistleblower protections would supersede the NDA in cases involving child welfare did Jessica begin to share her story. She had been fired after confronting Richard about inappropriate behavior she'd witnessed toward Charlotte, including forcing the child to sit motionless at the dinner table for hours as punishment for minor infractions, and what Jessica euphemistically called nighttime visits to the child's room that left Charlotte withdrawn and physically marked the following day. When Jessica had threatened to report her concerns, Richard had fabricated theft allegations against her, using his connections with the local police to have her briefly detained before offering the settlement in exchange for her silence. "I've carried this guilt for 2 years," Jessica confessed, tears streaming down her face. "I took the money because I have 3 kids and was facing jail time for something I didn't do. But I've thought about that little girl every day since." While Vanessa built their defense strategy, Charlotte's life at the Blackwell mansion had changed dramatically. With Maya gone, Eleanor had moved in, permanently taking charge of Charlotte's care and education. The child was withdrawn from her private school, allegedly to protect her from media attention, but effectively isolating her from teachers or classmates who might notice her deteriorating condition. Eleanor monitored all of Charlotte's activities, restricting her access to phones or computers and accompanying her to the carefully choreographed therapy sessions with Dr. Time Scrat Phillips that were designed to reinforce the narrative of Maya's abuse. Charlotte's previous extracurricular activities, including ballet lessons and art classes that Maya had encouraged, were canceled due to her fragile emotional state. The only person who noticed the troubling changes in Charlotte was her former homeroom teacher, Miss Andrea Bennett, who had attempted to visit after hearing about the case. Eleanor had turned her away at the door, but not before Miss Bennett glimpsed Charlotte in the background, noticeably thinner and hollow-eyed. Concerned Miss Bennett, Bennett had contacted Child Protective Services, triggering a superficial investigation that Richard's connections quickly derailed. However, the report created a record that Vanessa was able to access, adding another piece to the puzzle she was assembling. As the pretrial hearing approached, Vanessa worked tirelessly to uncover Richard's pattern of behavior, connecting with a court clerk who anonymously confirmed that Rebecca Blackwell had filed for a restraining order against Richard 3 months before her death, only to withdraw it a week later. Medical records from 5 different emergency rooms revealed that both Rebecca and Charlotte had been treated for suspicious injuries over the years, always at facilities, far from their home, always with different explanations, and always with Richard's substantial donations following shortly after. Vanessa's investigative work did not go unnoticed by the Blackwell camp, and the pressure intensified as the trial date grew closer. Lisa received a visit from Eleanor ostensibly to express sympathy for her sister's mental health issues, but actually to offer a substantial payment if Lisa would convince Maya to accept a plea deal. During this conversation, Eleanor inadvertently revealed knowledge of specific injuries to Charlotte that had never been made public information that Lisa immediately reported to Vanessa. The prosecution continued building their case against Maya, painting her as a calculating abuser who had targeted a vulnerable child while exploiting her position of trust. District Attorney James Harrison, a longtime friend of Richard's, who had received substantial campaign contributions from Blackwell Industries, personally took charge of the case, holding press conferences that further vilified Maya, while portraying Richard as a devoted father seeking justice for his daughter. Behind the scenes, Vanessa filed motion after motion, seeking access to unedited security footage, Charlotte's complete medical history, and records of previous household employee settlements. Most were denied, but each denial created an appeal issue, slowly building a record of judicial decisions that appeared increasingly biased as they accumulated. A breakthrough came when Vanessa secured a court order for Charlotte to undergo an independent psychological evaluation, arguing successfully before a different judge that the child's testimony was the linchpin of the Article 70 prosecution's case and deserved neutral assessment. Richard fought the order vigorously, appealing all the way to the state Supreme Court on grounds of Charlotte's privacy and emotional well-being, but ultimately lost. The evaluation was scheduled for the week before trial, setting the stage for the first opportunity to separate Charlotte from her father and grandmother's influence since Maya's arrest. As Maya approached her 100th day in detention, the case had evolved from what appeared to be a straightforward abuse allegation into a complex web of power control and systemic corruption, with a child's well-being and a woman's freedom hanging in the balance. The fluorescent lights in the law library of the detention center buzzed overhead as Maya and Vanessa spread their growing case files across the scratched metal table, systematically building their defense against Richard Blackwell's formidable legal offensive. Think of this like chess. Vanessa explained, her voice low, to avoid being overheard by the guard posted near the door. Richard expected us to play a defensive game, constantly reacting to his moves. Instead, we're building our own attack, forcing him to respond to us. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward case against Maya had evolved into a complex investigation into the Blackwell family's dark history, with each new discovery reinforcing their theory that Richard was the true abuser who had framed Maya to silence her. Through dogged persistence and a network of professional contacts, Vanessa had uncovered a pattern of domestic violence complaints filed by Rebecca Blackwell in the 3 years before her death, each mysteriously withdrawn within days of domestic violence complaints filed by Rebecca Blackwell in the 3 years before her death. Filing. The most damning report had come just 2 weeks before Rebecca's fatal fall down the marble staircase, describing persistent physical intimidation and fear for my child's safety. The responding officer had noted visible bruising on Rebecca's arms and a split lip that matched the injuries Charlotte had displayed the morning after Richard's late-night visit to her room. Vanessa had also obtained financial records showing suspicious payments to 3 different medical professionals who had treated Charlotte and Rebecca for what were documented as household accidents. Each doctor had subsequently received substantial donations from the Blackwell Family Foundation to their affiliated hospitals or research programs, creating a clear pattern of financial incentive for medical discretion. "He's been buying silence for years," Maya observed, reviewing the payment dates that aligned precisely with emergency room visits. And not just from doctors. Richard's former business partner, Alexander Winters, had initially refused to speak with Vanessa, but after being served with a formal subpoena, had reluctantly revealed details of Richard's volatile temper and controlling behavior in professional settings. "If he treats business associates that way," Alexander had testified in his deposition, "I can only imagine how he behaves with those he considers beneath him." The most powerful potential witness for their defense was Dr. Sarah Kim, Charlotte's pediatrician for the past 7 years, who had documented her concerns about the frequency and nature of the child's injuries in meticulous notes that she had kept separate from the official medical records. After noticing that her previous reports to Child Protective Services had been mysteriously closed without investigation, Dr. Kim faced potential professional consequences for coming forward, as Richard sat on the board of the hospital network that employed her, but her concern for Charlotte outweighed her career considerations. "I've been documenting my suspicions for years," she told Vanessa during their confidential meeting. The injuries themselves were concerning, but more troubling was Charlotte's behavior during examinations, particularly her extreme fear reaction when I asked about her home life. While Maya and Vanessa built their case methodically, Richard's mother, Eleanor, made a critical mistake that provided them with unexpected ammunition. She had approached Lisa, Maya's sister, outside her workplace, offering a substantial payment if she would convince Maya to stop making wild accusations and accept responsibility. During this conversation, Eleanor had mentioned specific details about bruising on Charlotte's back that had never been included in the public charges or media reports. Information she could only have known if she had either seen the injuries herself or been told about them by Richard. Lisa, quick thinking despite her shock, had recorded the latter part of this conversation on her phone, capturing Eleanor saying, "Those marks on her back weren't from any fall like Maya claims. A child doesn't get symmetrical bruises on both shoulder blades from falling." This statement directly contradicted the official narrative that Maya had been the only one aware of these particular injuries, inadvertently confirming that the Blackwells had known about and concealed Charlotte's abuse before Maya had documented it. The recording became a pivotal piece of evidence after Vanessa successfully argued for its admissibility, forcing the prosecution to explain how Eleanor knew about injuries that supposedly only Maya had inflicted and observed. Another significant victory came when Vanessa secured a court order for Charlotte to undergo an independent psychological evaluation with Dr. Place. Renee Washington, a specialist in childhood trauma, with no connections to the Blackwell family. Richard had fought this evaluation, aggressively filing multiple motions to block the appointment on grounds ranging from Charlotte's privacy to allegations of Dr. Washington's bias against successful businessmen. When these tactics failed, Richard's legal team had attempted to have one of Eleanor's chosen support persons present during the evaluation, a request Dr. Washington firmly rejected as potentially influencing Charlotte's responses. The evaluation was scheduled for the week before trial, representing the first opportunity to assess Charlotte outside the controlling environment of the Blackwell household. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Harrison, continued presenting Maya as an opportunistic criminal who had targeted a vulnerable family, exploiting racist stereotypes while carefully avoiding explicitly racial language. Their narrative suggested Maya had abused Charlotte out of jealousy and resentment of the Blackwells' wealth and privilege, portraying Richard as a devoted single father, blindsided by betrayal from someone he had trusted with his most precious responsibility. In preparation for trial, Vanessa arranged a series of mock cross-examinations for Maya, drilling her on remaining calm when confronted with edited video footage that appeared incriminating when taken out of context. "They'll try to provoke an emotional response," Vanessa warned. "An angry black woman is exactly the image they want to present to the jury. No matter what they show or claim, we stay focused, factual, and composed." Their preparation was interrupted by news that would significantly impact their strategy. The judge initially assigned to their case, Robert Campbell, had recused himself after Vanessa filed a motion detailing his social connections to Richard and suggesting potential bias. The case was reassigned to Judge Marian Diaz, a respected jurist known for her strict adherence to procedural rules and intolerance for courtroom theatrics. With Judge Diaz presiding, Vanessa successfully petitioned for full disclosure of all surveillance footage from the Blackwell residence, not just the edited clips the prosecution had cherry-picked. The prosecution claimed the original unedited footage had been routinely overwritten, according to the security company's standard protocols, a convenient destruction of evidence that Vanessa immediately challenged. How fortunate that the only footage preserved happens to be the moments that support Mr. Blackwell's accusations, she remarked during the hearing, while everything that might exonerate Miss Wilson has mysteriously disappeared. As the trial date approached, the prosecution made one final attempt to undermine Maya's credibility by introducing a surprise witness, a former student's parent who claimed Maya had been unnecessarily physical when restraining children during her teaching career. Vanessa's investigator quickly discovered that this parent had recently received a junior executive position at one of Blackwell's subsidiary companies after years of unemployment, calling the testimony's legitimacy into one read and dotty. Serious question. When confronted with this connection, the prosecution withdrew the witness, but the incident reinforced just how far Richard was willing to go to destroy Maya's reputation and secure her conviction. On the eve of the trial, Lisa visited Maya at the detention center, bringing news that Charlotte had been withdrawn from the independent psychological evaluation after allegedly becoming too distressed to continue. Instead, the prosecution would be relying solely on Dr. Phillips' evaluation and Charlotte's heavily coached testimony, which would be delivered via closed-circuit television to protect her from the trauma of facing her abuser in court. Despite this setback, Vanessa remained cautiously optimistic about their chances. "They're running scared," she told Maya as they reviewed their strategy one final time. "Every roadblock they throw up tells me we're on the right track. Richard wouldn't be working this hard to prevent a fair trial if he weren't terrified of the truth coming out." As they gathered their materials to leave, Vanessa placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "Tomorrow we start telling your story. Not his version, not the media's version, but what really happened in that house. Are you ready?" Maya nodded, thinking of Charlotte and all they had both endured. "I'm ready to fight not just for myself, but for her. She deserves someone who won't give up on her." Comment number 1. If you believe the justice system treats everyone equally, regardless of wealth or race. Or comment number 2. If you think money and privilege too often tip the scales. Hit that like button if you're inspired by Maya's courage in fighting back against false accusations, and subscribe to see how this dramatic courtroom battle unfolds. Will Charlotte find the courage to speak the truth, despite her father's influence? Can Vanessa expose the web of lies Richard has spun? Or will Richard's power and connections allow him to continue his abuse, while an innocent woman takes the blame? Stay with me for the next part of this incredible true story of justice, courage, and the fight against powerful forces trying to bury the truth. The Suffolk County Superior Courthouse stood imposingly against the gray October sky as journalists and spectators lined the broad stone steps, straining for a glimpse of the principal figures in what the Boston Herald had dubbed the trial of the decade. Maya entered through a side door, escorted by court officers and flanked by Vanessa, the orange detention center jumpsuit, replaced by a conservative navy blue suit that Lisa had purchased specifically for the trial. Despite her attorney's efforts to have her released on bail pending trial, Maya had spent 124 days in detention. The time etched in her face through new lines of worry and a gravitas that hadn't been there before her arrest. Inside the packed courtroom, Richard Blackwell sat at the prosecution table, looking every inch the grieving father in an expertly tailored charcoal suit. His silver-streaked dark hair perfectly groomed his expression, a carefully constructed mask of concerned parenthood. Eleanor sat directly behind him in the first row, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line as she surveyed the proceedings with cold eyes. Judge Marian Diaz entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her reputation for punctuality and no-nonsense management of her courtroom immediately evident as she silenced the murmuring crowd with a sharp gavel strike. After preliminary instructions to the newly seated jury of 8 women and 4 men, District Attorney James Harrison rose for his opening statement, moving to stand directly before the jury box with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with well-rehearsed sincerity. "This case is about betrayal of the most fundamental trust a parent can place in another person, the safety and well-being of their child." For the next 40 minutes, Harrison wove a compelling narrative of Maya as a resentful employee who had systematically abused Charlotte while hiding behind a facade of concern allegedly driven by jealousy of the Blackwells' wealth and social standing. Though he never explicitly mentioned race, his rhetorical choices played on deeply rooted stereotypes, describing Maya as intimidating, deceptive, and harboring unexpressed rage that she unleashed on a defenseless child when no one was watching. He referenced her disadvantaged background in contrast to the privileged environment Charlotte had been born into, subtly suggesting class resentment as motivation. Throughout this character assassination, Maya maintained the composed demeanor Vanessa had coached her to display, though her hands trembled slightly beneath the table where only her attorney could see. When Harrison concluded by dramatically promising to prove Maya's guilt beyond any shadow of doubt, Vanessa rose for the defense's opening statement, her approach a stark contrast to the emotional appeal of the prosecution. Rather than matching Harrison's theatrical style, she presented herself as the voice of reason and methodical analysis, acknowledging the serious nature of the charges while systematically laying out the flawed foundation of the prosecution's case. "The evidence will show," she stated firmly, maintaining steady eye contact with each juror, "that Maya Wilson is not only innocent of these terrible accusations, but was herself a victim of a calculated effort to silence her after she discovered the true source of Charlotte Blackwell's injuries." She outlined the defense's position that Richard had been physically abusing his daughter for years, following a pattern established during his marriage, and had framed Maya when she began documenting Charlotte's injuries. Vanessa detailed the timeline of Maya's employment, emphasizing that Charlotte's documented injuries corresponded not with periods when Maya was alone with the child, but with Richard's returns from business trips. She promised evidence of Richard's history of domestic violence, suspicious financial transactions with medical professionals who had treated Charlotte's injuries, and testimony from former household staff about his controlling and volatile behavior. As Vanessa concluded her opening remarks, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted noticeably, with several jurors glancing at Richard with newly speculative expressions. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Detective Michael Reynolds, who had led Maya's arrest and initial investigation. Under Harrison's careful questioning, Reynolds described the mountain of evidence against Maya, including the edited surveillance footage showing interactions between Maya and Charlotte that, taken out of context, could appear concerning. He testified about photographs of Charlotte's injuries that had been provided by Richard, the psychological evaluation, from Dr. 8-2T. Phillips, indicating Charlotte's fear of Maya, and the apparent timeline establishing Maya's opportunity to inflict the documented injuries. When cross-examination began, Vanessa immediately challenged the detective's investigative process, establishing that he had never interviewed Maya before her arrest, had not sought unedited security footage, and had failed to investigate Charlotte's medical history beyond the records Richard had provided. Most damaging was Vanessa's revelation that Detective Reynolds' brother-in-law held a middle management position at Blackwell Industries, a potential conflict of interest he had never disclosed. By the time Reynolds stepped down, his credibility had been significantly undermined, with Judge Diaz instructing the jury to consider whether proper investigative protocols had been followed. Dr. Lawrence Phillips took the stand next, presenting himself as an expert in childhood trauma who had evaluated Charlotte through a series of therapeutic interviews. His testimony included carefully selected quotes from Charlotte that supported the narrative of Maya's abuse, describing how the child allegedly became anxious and withdrawn when discussing her caretaker. During cross-examination, Vanessa established that Dr. Phillips had received over $300,000 in consulting fees from Blackwell Industries in the 5 years preceding his evaluation of Charlotte, creating a clear financial incentive to produce findings favorable to Richard. She further demonstrated that his interview techniques could be considered leading and potentially contaminating of Charlotte's testimony, particularly as he had conducted these sessions in the Blackwell home with Eleanor present in an Evano adjacent room. When Vanessa presented records showing that Dr. Phillips had previously testified in 5 separate cases for wealthy clients involved in domestic disputes, always finding in favor of the parent who had retained his services, his professional objectivity appeared increasingly questionable. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Eleanor Blackwell, who described Maya as controlling and secretive, with Charlotte claiming she had noticed bruises on the child, but had assumed they were normal childhood injuries, until Richard discovered the systematic abuse. Under cross-examination, Eleanor struggled to explain how she had known about specific injuries that weren't public knowledge, becoming visibly flustered when Vanessa played the recording of her conversation with Lisa, mentioning bruises on Charlotte's shoulder blades that had never been included in the official charges. Her claim that Richard was a devoted father who would never harm a hair on Charlotte's head was directly contradicted when Vanessa introduced police reports of domestic disturbance calls to the Blackwell residence during Rebecca's lifetime reports. Eleanor insisted must be fabricated despite the official documentation. By the end of the first week of trial, the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative had begun showing significant cracks, though Harrison continued presenting evidence that on its surface appeared damning. The edited security footage showing ambiguous interactions between Maya and Charlotte. Testimony from Richard's personal assistant about Maya's allegedly obsessive interest in Charlotte's activities. Financial records suggesting Maya had researched flights to her cousin's home in Canada shortly before her termination presented as evidence of planned kidnapping rather than a family visit. Each piece of evidence, however, was systematically challenged during cross-examination with Vanessa, highlighting alternative interpretations and the selective nature of the prosecution's presentation. The defense case opened with testimony from Thomas Rodriguez, who described the atmosphere in the Blackwell household before and during Maya's employment. Despite visible nervousness about violating his non-disclosure agreement, Thomas detailed Charlotte's dramatic behavioral changes when her father was present versus absent, Richard's controlling management of household staff, and the pattern of previous employees leaving abruptly with financial settlements. Jessica Morales followed her testimony, particularly powerful as she described specific incidents of Richard's inappropriate behavior toward Charlotte that had prompted her to confront him, resulting in false theft accusations and her theft eventual separation agreement. The prosecution objected repeatedly to this testimony as irrelevant to the current charges, but Judge Diaz allowed it to continue, noting its relevance to establishing an alternative explanation for Charlotte's injuries. Dr. Prosecution for Have. Sarah Kim's testimony about her long-standing concerns regarding Charlotte's recurring injuries proved especially compelling as she presented her separate records documenting suspicious patterns that had begun years before. Maya's employment. Her professional assessment that the injuries were consistent with adult-inflicted trauma rather than childhood accidents directly contradicted the prosecution's claim that the abuse had begun only after Maya entered the household. Harrison's aggressive cross-examination attempted to portray Dr. Kim as resentful of Richard's influence at her hospital, but her calm clinical responses and clear concern for Charlotte's welfare remained unshaken. Throughout the defense presentation, Richard maintained his composed facade, though observers noted his jaw tightening and fingers drumming with increasing frequency as more witnesses contradicted his version of events. Eleanor's expressions alternated between indignation and alarm as the defense systematically dismantled the narrative they had so carefully constructed. The most dramatic moment came when Vanessa called Alexander Winters, Richard's former business partner, who testified about witnessing Richard violently lose his temper during private meetings, once throwing a heavy crystal paperweight at a wall near Alexander's head when a deal hadn't proceeded as planned. If he could barely control himself in professional settings, Alexander stated, "I often wondered what happened behind closed doors at home." As the second week of trial concluded, both legal teams prepared for what promised to be the most consequential testimony. Richard Blackwell would take the stand when court reconvened, followed by Maya's testimony with the question of Charlotte's appearance in court still unresolved as Richard's attorneys continued arguing that testifying would traumatize her further. What no one in the courtroom yet realized was that Charlotte herself was about to upend the entire proceeding in a way no one had anticipated, bringing the carefully constructed case crashing down with the simple, devastating truth that only ablation, a child, could deliver with such unassailable clarity. The third week of trial began with a palpable tension in courtroom 302 as Richard Blackwell took the stand, his tailored Italian suit and polished appearance, creating a striking visual contrast to Maya's more modest attire at the IPIESIAC defense table. For 4 hours, District Attorney Harrison led Richard through carefully rehearsed testimony, portraying him as a devoted father, blindsided by betrayal from a trusted employee. With practiced sincerity that brought tears to the eyes of several jurors, Richard described discovering bruises on Charlotte's back while helping her prepare for a bath, his voice breaking as he recounted her alleged confession that, "Miss Maya hurts me when you're not home." He detailed his agonizing decision to install additional security cameras, his heartbreak upon reviewing footage that appeared to show Maya using excessive force while dressing Charlotte, and his moral obligation to protect other children from a potential predator by pursuing criminal charges rather than simply terminating her employment. Throughout this performance, Maya maintained the composed demeanor Vanessa had coached, though her hands clenched tightly beneath the table as Richard systematically destroyed her reputation with practiced lies. When cross-examination began after lunch recess, Vanessa approached the witness stand with measured confidence, beginning with seemingly innocuous questions about Richard's business travel schedule that established his absence during periods when many of Charlotte's documented injuries had occurred. She then pivoted sharply, introducing medical records from 5 different emergency rooms where Charlotte had been treated for suspicious injuries long before Maya's employment, each facility located at increasing distances from the Parsis Blackwell home, each visit followed by substantial donations to the treating facilities. Mr. Blackwell, Vanessa asked, her tone deceptively conversational. "Can you explain why you drove past 4 closer hospitals to take Charlotte to Mount Auburn Medical Center at 2 in the morning when she had a broken wrist 3 years ago?" Richard's explanation about seeking the best care crumbled when Vanessa produced records showing the treating physician had received a research grant from the Blackwell Family Foundation 1 week later, despite having no prior connection to the family. As cross-examination continued, Richard's carefully maintained composure began showing cracks, his answers becoming defensive and his temper flaring when Vanessa introduced police reports documenting domestic disturbance calls to the Blackwell residence during his marriage. "Those were private matters between my wife and me," he snapped immediately, realizing his mistake as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. By the 3rd hour of cross-examination, Richard's testimony had devolved into a pattern of evasion, selective memory, and barely contained hostility, particularly when Vanessa introduced financial records showing payments to 3 previous housekeepers who had left the Blackwell household abruptly, each having signed non-disclosure agreements after making allegations similar to Maya's. Judge Diaz had to admonish him twice for non-responsive answers before Harrison called for a recess, claiming his client was being badgered by irrelevant questioning. When Richard returned to the stand the following morning, his demeanor had been carefully reconstructed into the grieving father persona, though the damage to his credibility was evident in the skeptical expressions of several jurors. The defense continued, methodically exposing inconsistencies in his testimony, particularly regarding the timeline of Charlotte's injuries and his claim of being unaware of any problems until discovering Maya's alleged abuse. The most damaging moment came when Vanessa presented an email Richard had sent to Dr. Phillips 3 weeks before Maya's termination, instructing him to find evidence supporting my concerns about the nanny's behavior and promising a substantial consultation fee for his cooperation. Richard's claim that this was simply seeking professional guidance appeared hollow against the explicit language of the message. As Richard finally stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecution's case had sustained significant damage, though Harrison worked diligently to repair it through redirect examination, emphasizing Charlotte's current fear and emotional distress which he attributed entirely to Maya's alleged actions. The following day, Maya took the stand to tell her side of the story, her voice steady despite the enormous stakes of her testimony. For nearly 5 hours, she detailed her employment at the Blackwell mansion, describing her growing concern about Charlotte's behavior, particularly following Richard's returns from business trips and her documentation of injuries that couldn't be explained by normal childhood activities. She testified about Charlotte's increasing anxiety, bedwetting, and reluctance to be alone with her father, culminating in the night she heard crying from the child's room and encountered Richard emerging disheveled and smelling of alcohol. Maya's description of her termination, after attempting to document Charlotte's split lip and bruised wrist, provided a compelling alternative narrative to Richard's account. Her testimony, corroborated by the journal entries and photographs she had managed to preserve by sending to her personal email before Richard confiscated her phone. Harrison's cross-examination attempted to portray Maya as resentful of the Blackwells' wealth and privilege, suggesting she had manipulated Charlotte to seek vengeance against Richard for perceived slights. Despite his aggressive questioning and attempts to provoke an emotional response, Maya remained composed, consistently redirecting attention to her concern for Charlotte's welfare rather than her own legal jeopardy. By the trial's 4th week, both legal teams had presented the bulk of their cases, with only a few remaining witnesses and closing arguments scheduled before jury deliberation would begin. The most significant unresolved question remained whether Charlotte would testify, with the prosecution having successfully delayed her court appearance through multiple motions, citing concerns about her emotional fragility. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Charlotte's school counselor Melissa Jenkins contacted Child Protective Services after the child experienced what was described as a significant psychological episode following a video call with Eleanor, during which her grandmother had apparently coached her extensively on what to say in court. The CPS report triggered an emergency hearing before Judge Diaz, who ordered Charlotte to undergo an immediate, independent psychological evaluation with Dr. Renee Washington, overruling the prosecution's strenuous objections. Dr. Washington's evaluation, conducted over 2 sessions without Eleanor or Richard present, revealed alarming findings. Charlotte displayed classic signs of long-term psychological abuse, with specific trauma responses triggered by mentions of her father rather than Maya. During their 2nd session, Charlotte had broken down after seeing a photograph of Maya crying that Maya tried to help me, and now she's in trouble because of Daddy's lies. Based on Dr. Washington's report, Judge Diaz ordered Charlotte to appear in court the following day, though she permitted a modified setup with a screen between Charlotte and the gallery to minimize her exposure to the public and media. When Charlotte entered the courtroom, the transformation in her appearance from the vibrant child Maya had known was shocking, thin, and pale, with dark circles under her eyes, her once bouncy blonde curls hanging limp around a face devoid of childhood animation. She moved like a much older person, hesitant and hyper-aware of her surroundings, flinching at sudden movements or sounds. Eleanor accompanied her to the witness stand, but was directed to sit in the front row during testimony, visibly displeased by this separation. Harrison began questioning with extreme gentleness, asking simple questions about Charlotte's age school and favorite activities before gradually transitioning to questions about her relationship with Maya. Charlotte's responses seemed rehearsed, her voice barely audible as she gave one-word answers affirming that Maya had hurt her and made her scared. When Harrison asked her to describe specific incidents of alleged abuse, Charlotte glanced repeatedly toward Eleanor, before providing vague descriptions that matched the prosecution's previously established narrative. During this testimony, Maya noticed Charlotte's hand movements, recognizing the child's habit of tapping her fingers in a particular pattern when anxious or untruthful, a behavior she had observed during their reading sessions when teased. Charlotte would fabricate excuses for not completing homework. Vanessa began her cross-examination with similar gentle questioning about neutral topics, gradually establishing rapport before addressing the allegations. She showed Charlotte photographs of injuries from the prosecution's evidence, asking open-ended questions about when and how they had occurred. With each question, Charlotte's responses became increasingly hesitant, her eyes darting toward Eleanor, who was making subtle gestures from her seat. After the third such exchange, Judge Diaz ordered Eleanor removed from the courtroom for the remainder of Charlotte's testimony, ignoring Harrison's vehement objection. With Eleanor gone, Charlotte's demeanor shifted subtly, her shoulders relaxing slightly, though she continued giving rehearsed answers. The pivotal moment came when Vanessa showed her a photograph not previously introduced into evidence, a picture of Charlotte and Maya together at the public library, both smiling over a favorite book. Vanessa asked gently, "Were you afraid of Maya in this picture?" Charlotte stared at the photograph for a long moment, tears welling in her eyes as she whispered, "No, Maya was nice. Maya tried to help me." From the defendant's table, Richard surged to his feet loudly, instructing Charlotte to remember what we practiced. Judge Diaz immediately ordered him to sit down, threatening contempt charges, but the damage was done. Charlotte's eyes widened with visible terror at her father's outburst, triggering a panic response that no amount of coaching could contain. In that moment of crisis, Charlotte broke free from the witness stand, running not to her father or the court officers, but directly to Maya, clinging to her former caretaker as sobs racked her small frame. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Richard lunged toward them, court officers restraining him, while Harrison frantically called for recess. Judge Diaz ordered the courtroom cleared, except for essential personnel, but not before journalists captured the devastating visual contradiction to the prosecution's narrative: the allegedly abused child seeking protection from her supposed abuser while fleeing from her protective father. In the judge's chambers, with court-appointed advocates present, Charlotte finally revealed the full truth that had been buried beneath layers of coercion, fear, and elaborate lies. Maya had never hurt her. The injuries had been inflicted by Richard, continuing a pattern of abuse that had begun years earlier, escalating after her mother's death. Maya had discovered the abuse and had been documenting evidence when Richard fabricated the accusations against her. As Charlotte's testimony continued, in the more private setting, she revealed the depths of her father's psychological manipulation, including threats that she would be taken away from everyone she loved if she ever told the truth about the accidents that regularly occurred in their home. The case that had begun as a straightforward prosecution of an allegedly abusive caregiver had transformed into a revelation of the darkness hiding behind wealth, power, and social standing, all exposed by the courage of a prosecution place Cavell, 9-year-old girl who in her moment of crisis had instinctively sought protection from the only adult who had truly tried to protect her. The autumn sunlight streamed through the high windows of Judge Diaz's chambers, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air, seemingly suspended in time, much like the collective breath of everyone present as Charlotte Blackwell finally spoke her truth. With court-appointed child advocate Sandra Moreno beside her, and a trauma-specialized psychologist Dr. Renee Washington guiding the conversation, Charlotte revealed the full extent of what had occurred in the Blackwell mansion behind its imposing gates and carefully maintained facade. Her small voice grew stronger as the burden of secrets lifted from her narrow shoulders, describing years of physical punishments for infractions as minor as spilling a drink or speaking too loudly while her father worked. After Mommy died, she explained, twisting a tissue between her fingers, it got worse because there was nobody else for Daddy to be mad at. The abuse had followed a predictable pattern. Richard's stress from business would build during trips away from home, culminating in explosive rage upon his return, with Charlotte bearing the brunt of his uncontrolled temper. He had become expert at inflicting injuries that could be concealed beneath clothing, particularly focused on her back, upper arms, and torso areas that wouldn't be visible during her public appearances at school or social functions. The night before Maya's termination had been particularly severe, with Richard returning intoxicated from a failed business negotiation and entering Charlotte's room to berate her about a mediocre math quiz result. Her teacher had emailed him. When Charlotte had tried to explain the difficulty of the material, he had struck her across the face, splitting her lip, and grabbed her wrist so forcefully it had bruised instantly. Maya had heard Charlotte's crying and investigated encountering Richard in the hallway. The following morning, seeing Maya documenting Charlotte's injuries had triggered Richard's realization that his actions might finally face consequences, leading to his elaborate scheme to silence Maya through false accusations. Most disturbing was Charlotte's revelation about her mother's death 2 years earlier, which she hesitantly described as happening after a violent argument rather than the accidental fall reported to authorities. "Daddy and Mommy were fighting at the top of the stairs," she whispered, eyes fixed on the floor. "She said she was going to take me away from him, and he pushed her. I saw it from my bedroom door." Eleanor had found Charlotte beside her mother's body and had orchestrated the cover-up, explaining to the traumatized 7-year-old that no one would believe her and that she would be taken away from her home if she ever revealed what she had witnessed. After Charlotte's revelations, Judge Diaz immediately suspended the trial proceedings, ordering an emergency hearing to determine custody arrangements and initiating a comprehensive investigation into both Rebecca Blackwell's death and the allegations against Richard. District Attorney Harrison, recognizing the catastrophic collapse of his case against Maya and the potential professional consequences of his close association with Richard, recused himself, citing newly discovered conflicts of interest. His second-in-command, Assistant District Attorney Monica Patel, took over, promptly filing a motion to dismiss all charges against Maya while simultaneously opening an investigation into Richard for child abuse witness tampering, evidence fabrication, and obstruction of justice. The judge ordered Charlotte placed in temporary custody with her maternal aunt Catherine Bennett, who had maintained limited contact with Charlotte despite Eleanor's efforts to isolate the child from her mother's family following Rebecca's death. A team of social workers and trauma specialists was assigned to support Charlotte's transition and begin the long process of healing from years of abuse and manipulation. Richard was taken into custody directly from the courtroom, his requests for bail denied due to his significant flight risk and potential danger to witnesses. Eleanor faced her own legal jeopardy, charged as an accessory after the fact for her role in concealing Charlotte's abuse and coaching her testimony. The case that had begun as a seemingly straightforward prosecution of a caregiver had transformed into one of the most significant domestic violence and child abuse investigations in the state's recent history, with far-reaching implications as additional victims began coming forward. Maya walked out of the courthouse, a free woman after 147 days of wrongful detention, emerging into the crisp autumn air beside Vanessa Taylor, who had an arm protectively around her shoulders as they faced the barrage of media cameras and shouted questions. In a brief statement, Maya expressed gratitude for those who had supported her throughout the ordeal, particularly her sister Lisa and the legal team that had fought tirelessly to expose the truth. Rather than expressing bitterness about her wrongful prosecution, she focused on Charlotte's well-being, asking for privacy and compassion for a child who had endured unimaginable trauma and now faced a difficult recovery. "This case was never about me," she concluded, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "It was always about protecting a vulnerable child from harm. I'm grateful that Charlotte finally has the safety and support she deserves." In the months that followed, the repercussions of the case extended far beyond the Blackwell family. An independent investigation revealed systemic failures within Child Protective Services, where reports concerning wealthy and influential families had been routinely downgraded in priority or closed without proper investigation. Multiple medical professionals who had treated Charlotte's injuries without filing mandatory abuse reports faced disciplinary proceedings and potential license revocation. The police department initiated an internal affairs investigation into Detective Reynolds and others involved in Maya's arrest, examining whether proper protocols had been followed or if Richard's influence had corrupted the investigative process. Blackwell Industries experienced immediate financial impact as investors distanced themselves from the scandal, with board members forcing the appointment of an interim CEO while Richard awaited trial. Eleanor's prominent position in Boston society crumbled as former friends and charitable organizations severed ties, unwilling to associate with someone who had enabled child abuse and attempted to frame an innocent woman. 6 months after her release, Maya had begun rebuilding her life, working with a non-profit organization, supporting victims of domestic violence, and using her experience to advocate for reforms in how abuse allegations are investigated across socioeconomic boundaries. Lisa had been able to refinance her mortgage thanks to a successful civil suit against the city for wrongful imprisonment, though the emotional toll of the ordeal remained evident in Maya's occasional nightmares and hypervigilance. Charlotte, now living with her Aunt Catherine, had started therapy with Dr. Washington and was slowly regaining the childhood that had been stolen from her. Though still struggling with complex trauma symptoms, she had returned to school part-time and was showing small signs of healing, laughing, occasionally engaging in art therapy, and forming a tentative bond with her aunt's gentle, golden retriever. Catherine had arranged periodic visits between Charlotte and Maya, recognizing the important supportive role Maya had played in her niece's life and the unique understanding they shared as survivors of Richard's abuse. During one such visit, Maya had brought a copy of the book they had been reading together before her arrest, and the simple joy on Charlotte's face as they resumed their tradition had brought tears to both Catherine's and Maya's eyes. On a crisp April morning nearly a year after her initial arrest, Maya sat in the back row of a different courtroom, watching as Charlotte entered with her victim advocate to deliver her impact statement at Richard's sentencing hearing. The girl who stepped to the podium bore little resemblance to the terrified child who had broken down during trial. 9 months of safety therapy and genuine care had begun the transformation from victim to survivor. Though still small for her 10 years, Charlotte stood straight as she faced the judge, her voice clear and steady as she read from her prepared statement. "My father taught me that power means never having to say you're sorry, that money can make problems disappear, and that no one would believe me if I told the truth." She began, her words echoing in the silent courtroom. "But I learned something different from Maya and from what happened in this court. I learned that truth is stronger than lies, no matter how big the lies are or how powerful the person telling them." As Charlotte continued describing the impact of years of abuse and the ongoing process of recovery, Maya observed Richard at the defense table, his expensive suit replaced by prison attire, his once commanding presence diminished by the evidence of his crimes that had mounted over months of investigation. The man who had once seemed invincible, capable of destroying lives with a single phone call, now avoided meeting his daughter's gaze as she spoke her truth without fear for the first time. When Charlotte finished her statement, concluding with hope for her future and gratitude for those who had helped her find safety, she turned from the podium and walked directly to where Maya sat. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around her former caretaker in a tight hug that communicated more than words ever could. As they embraced, Maya whispered, "I'm so proud of you," feeling Charlotte's smile against her shoulder before the child returned to her aunt's side. Richard Blackwell, once one of the most powerful men in Boston, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for child abuse witness, tampering, perjury, and a host of other charges. The investigation into Rebecca's death had been reopened based on Charlotte's testimony, with additional charges pending, as forensic experts re-examined evidence from what had previously been ruled an accident. Eleanor received a lesser sentence for her role as an accessory, though at her age, even the 5-year term represented a potentially life-ending consequence. As Maya left the courthouse for the final time, spring sunshine warming her face, she reflected on the extraordinary journey from trusted caregiver to accused criminal to vindicated advocate. The system that had initially failed both her and Charlotte had ultimately, if imperfectly, delivered justice, though only after enormous personal cost, and the determined efforts of those who refused to be silenced by power and diffused privilege. The road ahead would not be easy for any of them, particularly Charlotte, who faced years of healing from both physical and psychological wounds. Yet watching the child walking hand in hand with her aunt toward a future free from fear, Maya felt genuine hope for the first time since that terrible night in the Blackwell mansion when she had heard a little girl crying and chosen to investigate rather than look away. Sometimes she realized justice depends not on systems or institutions, but on the courage of individuals willing to stand firm in their truth, even against the most formidable opponents. Charlotte had found that courage, as had Maya herself, proving that even the most carefully constructed facade of power cannot forever conceal the truth when voices rise together to speak it. What do you think about the outcome of this case? Was justice truly served? Or should Richard and Eleanor Blackwell have faced even more severe consequences for their actions? Comment below with your thoughts on how we as a society can better protect vulnerable children regardless of their family's wealth or status. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to hear more powerful narratives of courage against injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the truth can prevail even when the odds seem impossible. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most remarkable cases of justice triumphing over privilege and power. This story exposes how wealth and power can corrupt justice and how racial bias can be weaponized against innocent people. Maya's ordeal illustrates the devastating impact of false accusations amplified by societal prejudices. Richard Blackwell exploited both his privilege and racist stereotypes to frame an innocent black woman, knowing the system would be predisposed to believe him over her. The case demonstrates how institutions meant to protect the vulnerable, courts, police, child protective services, can be manipulated by those with resources and connections. Yet, it also highlights the transformative power of perseverance and truth. Maya refused to accept a plea deal despite overwhelming pressure, standing firm in her innocence, even when the system failed her. Her determination, combined with Vanessa's legal brilliance and Charlotte's ultimate courage, eventually overcame the barriers of prejudice and privilege. Most importantly, the story reminds us to question narratives that too conveniently align with societal biases. When accusations against marginalized individuals perfectly match stereotypes, we must examine them with particular scrutiny. True justice requires looking beyond appearances, wealth disparities, and racial differences to see the human truth beneath. In the end, it wasn't wealth or power that prevailed, but the unbreakable human spirit and the courage to speak truth regardless of consequences. Have you witnessed how wealth and power can influence justice in your community? Or perhaps you've seen someone stand bravely against false accusations like Maya did. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Has this story changed your perspective on how we judge situations based on first appearances or societal biases? Comment justice if you believe our system needs reform to better protect the vulnerable regardless of race or economic status. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button to help others find it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that challenge our perceptions and reveal hidden truths about our society. And please share this video with someone who needs to understand that speaking truth to power, while difficult, is always worth the fight. Thank you for joining me on this journey through darkness into light. Remember, in a world where money and privilege often dictate outcomes, your voice speaking truth can be the most powerful force for change.